Nathan, who kind of hails from DC, he's very respected in the kind of the design system community, and has been thinking a lot and working a lot on how to use like modern emerging tools for the betterment of component systems and design systems. I don't know about you, but there were some points that were made in Nick's talk at the end of yesterday that really resonated to me about complexity and about the aim to simplify things by adding one more thing, which will be the simple things that makes all of the other things redundant, and then you've got another thing. I've lived that life very much, particularly in the enterprise space where people have been building large component libraries and big systems that have just been so difficult to navigate and so difficult to reason about. I wish there were some tools and some processes for making these things simpler and more rational. And I think some of the tools that are now coming into fruition, particularly using AI to simplify and to kind of rationalize some of the data and the components that we might use in our design systems, could become really exciting. So here, touching on some of those things, I think, and bringing us his wisdom. Please make him very, very welcome with a giant round of applause. It's Nathan Curtis. Nathan.
Hello, everybody. So great to be back at Smashing. I really appreciate coming and visiting with this great community. And today I'm going to talk about components as data for humans and machines. I'll start with, this all feels like quite a tornado. This is a sculpture as staircase in the Phoenix Museum that I visited on Sunday. I did 4 museums in one day. It was wonderful. But the Phoenix Museum is actually about migration and people and feeling a part of a community or not, and the lessons that we have to learn about that. And I really reflected on coming in, gosh, I'm so nervous today. Coming to Smashing again to talk about something and demo on stage. I am scared to death, but you're all so welcoming. And so I was telling the story, and I was like, I went to the Phoenix Museum as I was getting my hair cut, and they were like looking at me like I'm this other. And when you're at this museum, you walk through a very large portal where it says EU citizens and not EU citizens. And I meekly walked through the non-EU citizens to feel it, because as a US citizen, we're totally being jerks right now. And so I can appreciate that, like, that would be a reason people would be like, oh, wait, why? I said, no. They were like, no, because you were in Rotterdam. And everybody in Amsterdam apparently doesn't like Rotterdam, and I misread the culture at all, or completely. And so it really makes me feel great to be among people and reflect on the things that I'm working on and share those experiences. One of the quotes from that museum was, if we want to know where we are going, we first have to understand where we come from. And so this talk is actually about AI all around me and my own little thing that isn't AI at all. And it starts with this handoff. And I think Christine talked about handoff, hates the term. Really, handoff, I've taught this sort of classical process for making components where designers are planning and then designing in Figma, and then they create a spec, and that spec is the thing they hand off to produce the component, both the code and the documentation for the code, but also finish the Figma asset and publish all the things so people can use it. And really, that handoff moment is a decisive moment. You make decisions. You really agree upon the kinds of things that the component's going to have. And so, to me, I live in a space where, first off, I'm not a product designer, I'm a system designer. And I'm a system designer that's not working with one platform, but pretty much all my projects are delivering to 3 platforms: Android, iOS, and some form of web, like React, typically, or web components or something similar. And so that's my context. And as I think about where we're at today, suddenly there's this whirlwind, because now we're producing design intent from more places. It's not just from Figma, even though that is still the hegemonic tool that every designer seems to use. There's PenPot, there's other things. But now they're starting to create design intent in a more appropriate place to solve some problems, whether it's Lovable, Cursor, or other things. And there's this design intent that needs to lead to this production implementation. But it turns out all these different places become an origin of truth. And I try to use that term as a way to characterize not necessarily the source of truth problem, but where ideas emerge, where intent is created. And today, this is sort of what I'm seeing in the companies that I work for, that all of these different tools, people are realizing things that need to be part of the definition of the thing they're all trying to implement together. And so I also think about where I want to be tomorrow, the kind of world I want to live in tomorrow. And I don't have complete confidence on all the design tools. Like, this isn't the Figma is dead. I love Figma. I make income from Figma. Like, there's things about Figma that are really, really great. But I'm not convinced that in 5 years or 10 years, that's how people will express their design intent. And so where are we going to characterize that truth for tomorrow? And so I've lived this sort of arc of my career over the last 5 years or so, where I produced a specs plugin, published it on the Figma community platform around 3 years ago, and it really spoke to people because it took all the things that they had made in Figma as a component in particular, and arrayed an artifact to help them understand what that component is. In particular, it really caught wind. Like, it has a lot of users, and it's part of my income because there's a part of the plugin that has in-app subscriptions and so on. And so I worked on it for 2 years really consistently. And one of the things that was like its secret sauce that people like at the time, 3 years ago, were like, oh my gosh, that's magic. Is it AI? Is it using AI? And I was like, I don't even know what AI pretty much is. I just wrote like a script to do this stuff. But the secret sauce was it would explore every layer and every property of every layer of every variant to find where the differences are. And so it could summarize for an alert, the actual only differences are the background and border colors of each of those different variants. And it also really changed the way I looked at using Figma and thinking about modeling the design decisions. Most people live on the left-hand side, where you have the actual variant and you see all the variants. And they use the panel to explore it. Well, to me, like, I live just as much in that console on the right side. I'm testing. I'm really trying to look up values. Like, to me, like, suddenly I start to see structure in that way. And when I saw people last year, or I think it was probably late 2024, but early 2025, they're like, yeah, we're taking screenshots of the spec and feeding the screenshot to AI. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that data is so well structured. I have all the answers, and they're making AI do all this heavy lifting to interpret an actual screen, a PNG file, essentially, to understand how the components define. I was like, there's definitely a better future. And so what is the future with AI to describe your design systems? Because there is so much stuff to describe that simple 5-variant alert component. There's 126 layers in there. There's over 11,000 key value pairs. You have to ask yourself, actually, what is Nathan showing? Is that the REST API or the plugin API? More on that later. They're not the same. It's frustrating. But the point is, there's a ton of data in there. And right now, we're pointing AI to go look at it and find the truth. So I started like a year or two ago. I said, well, I'll just like create a JSON version of the data that's inside, and I'll expose that. I really didn't think much of it. Like, it wasn't a big deal, and I don't know that many people actually used it. But to me, that was just that first starting point. But then I really started to realize the plugin itself had a bunch of weaknesses. It didn't compare all the different things. It just compared sort of the first level. Okay, what's the default button versus the hover button versus the active button, for example, but not all the different combinations of all the props. And there were a lot of other features that weren't in there that reflected the design intent that was in Figma. It was really stuck, and all the data in the output, like I haven't been developing for a decade, and so all the like code was threaded together. It was really bad. And so then I saw another potential feature, like how could we reflect all these things? The design MD file. It seems to be like all the rage. And so this is a transformed design MD file where, like, are people going to start describing their design system intent, that their intent is ornate Victorian filigree, dreamy storybook surrealism and dusky jewel tone contrast to evoke a melancholic, wistful myth without sacrificing operational clarity? Like, how are people going to start to describe their visual tone to get to the kind of design system they want to have? to me, like, it's compact. I like it, unless I keep adding to this and it becomes 20,000 lines long. But it's almost completely unstructured. I can't really see the intent. It's not really empirical. You can't measure the change in that description, in my opinion. And it's not necessarily complete. It doesn't have all the answers, and it's certainly not precise. And so when I see that, I see like a PDF of a web style guide from 2014. That's like what I see in this document. And like we have come so far since then. And I have a lot to talk about. A 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. There's all this scale of all these decisions that we spend so much time on to really define what we want out of our design system. And if we have all these brands and components and props and variants and elements and bound tokens and styles, but also now, like because we have AI, a lot of examples of how we're using slot content and ready-made instances and layouts and patterns and templates. All these things are going to really start to explode into the future of where design systems are going to go. That's not good enough to describe it in a single markdown file. It's almost insulting to the kind of like care and tending we do to have our design systems work really well. And we've been there. Like in 2016, I wrote this blog post where I was like so excited when I saw design tokens for the first time. I was like, that's a data structure. That's my decision. I have a primary color for the text. I know where to put that now. I have how I want to have a little line that separates things. It's like my low contrast line. I know where to put that decision now. And design tokens, everybody uses now. Everybody talks about it. Like everybody kind of have incorporated it into the work that they do. And so to me, that's now the current. That we now have a stable definition at the W3C that the Design Token Working Group got to last year. It's like official. Design tokens are there. I don't have delusions of grandeur, but I do want to ask myself, well, we did it for design tokens. Why can't we do it for components too? Why can't we have a way to describe the components that we have in a well-structured way? And so to me, maybe it looks something like this. This is actually the kind of highest level thing. You have a list of components. Each component is going to have props. It's going to have an anatomy. It's going to have this default layout and sort of definition of all of its elements and their styles and their bindings. And then you have variants, which in this spec is really the rules of how something changes from the default relative to the default. And you'll see it kind of looks like the way CSS works in a lot of ways. And so when you look at a spec, yeah, it looks like it's YAML. It's better formatted than JSON, but it looks like code, kind of. Turns out designers can read this. And they can, when they're evaluating their components, they can scan it to see whether or not it's actually reflecting the intent they have. There's actually some errors on the screen intentionally that you can like point out and start, as you adapt, to look at data and in a well-structured but fairly simple form, understand how the component's working. And it's all based on a whole schema or types of different decisions at different parts of that structure. And the fact that, as it turns out, typography is kind of complicated, effects on the lower right are even more complicated, but actually not as complicated as Figma lets you let them be. And all those things we want to weave tokens through. And so there's decisions about how we describe this that are informed by the way Figma's modeled, but also informed by how the code is modeled too. And how can you find a balance between Figma and the three code platforms to find some different middle ground at times to describe how the design decisions are that you've made. And so I've made a set of tools. I'm going to demo them on stage. I'm not really going to demo much of the plugin itself, like that you saw from before if you've used that specs plugin. But I'm going to also show command line interface tools that both use a same engine underneath that generates specs from Figma. And they're all based on this schema that I just sort of whizzed through to give you a glimpse of how we model the decisions that you have. And this has become sort of a tiered set of different tools that I've been developing and using on two of my clients, one of which has all those zeros that you saw before, 50 plus brands and all these different decisions, and another client that has started to use the tool too and is finding benefit from it. In both the clients, their workflows look kind of like this. You do start with a plan of a component, you do a lot of work in Figma, and then you click a button, you generate all the specs, and that feeds the coding. There's not a lot of MCP back and forth. They might use it to inspect some other things, but the actual source of truth for them to generate the code is predominantly starting from a generated set of specs plus the token service that they already had. And then that leads to coding. Now, AI is in a lot of places. That planning process was a great separate thing I could talk about around the researcher and design analyzer and component architect that we set up to look at legacy code and Figma designs to chart a path forward based on the conventions that we wanted to pursue into the future. And certainly, TJ was showing us a lot of great stuff of how you can use AI within Figma to create change and reflect the evolving design intent that you have. And then on coding, like I'm seeing my counterparts, I don't actually code components, but they use the generated spec and then have their own suite of agents to write code, to author stories, to audit accessibility, to visually review things and have quality gates and so on. But right there in the middle, that generated spec thing, it's just a script. It's just essentially one tool that transforms data from one place and gets it ready for another place. So I'm going to shift into working on the demo. And I'm going to start with being in VS Code, where I've got a clean repository called specs demo here. And I have these two just-in-case things. This is like the demo that's run, and like if things fail, like I can just refer to the actual produced stuff. I'm so nervous running code on stage. I've never done this before. So if it fails, I'm sorry. But I do have this essentially demo written up where I'm going to take you through a manual in Figma review of 3 different components and talk about the spec data. And then Claude's going to run all the commands, but I promise they're basic commands. There's only 5 commands that you run, and I'll talk through how they all work. And then it's going to do an analysis that I'm going to ask it to compare Figma's data that it starts from, the kind of stuff that TJ was saying, let's reach in and start to understand Figma from that, compared to the data that's generated from the spec. And so what I'm going to do is say, run the Claude portions of the open demo file while I do the manual stuff in Figma. Hope this works. So I'll just select everything, hit that. OK, so we'll come back to that. So in the meantime, we're going to go through what is 3 different components. And the first component is going to be this alert component that I was talking about before. And I'm going to zoom in here to the demo. But I am going to take a little detour. I probably shouldn't do this. Christine and I were talking about her layout stuff. And this is a little hack. You know, you can make it so that you have things that wrap. And the way that you do it is how we did it in code with Flexbox a long time ago with actually additional spacers. So that's a little Figma hack. If you want to ask me on the side afterwards, I'll be around for the rest of the day if you like to create cool layouts like that. Let's go back to the alert itself. So here I'm going to open up the right now it's called ANOVA. It's going to change to be the Specs 2, sort of the second generation of it. But this plugin is currently free and open on the community as well. And you effectively select a component, and you can set up some different settings. And the kinds of choices that you make reflect how, at times, we just want to configure how the data appears. And other times, we want to really tune the data to how we use Figma and have our own conventions. And so I do want to compare all the different combinations of all the properties. And I'm going to summarize invalid prop configurations at the end. I'm going to have it detect icon assets, where each design system tends to use their own naming convention for icon assets that are components in Figma, because they don't have different asset types that are reusable. They just have components that are reusable. And then also subcomponents and some other things that will come into play later. But in particular, I'm just going to have it dump the data onto the Figma canvas itself, even though later we'll see that you can just use a command line interface to use that. And so what it did was process all 124 layers to tell me what's the anatomy of this component. And it has a variety of different types of layers, effectively, but those are consolidated, and frames are containers. Instance nodes are also referred to as containers. The default is the root at the top. But it also detects things and says the type glyph based on the naming convention for that decorative icon that was on the right. It also has enumerated props. These are all like fairly straightforward, what you would expect to see, but there's a lot of intent here as well. For example, if you look at the icon is actually a string prop in code, and it's reflecting the instance swapping but also the fact that it has an example and not a default. The example isn't necessarily what you want to intend to be in there, and then it has additional extensions so that if you wanted to go back into Figma with the same data, it knows how to interpret those things. And so you can start to sense a little bit of the balance of transitioning from an environment like Figma to what you would expect more out of code. In addition, it creates the layout tree that you see here, as well as each of the elements have all of their non-default styles defined. And so if you see me scroll, you've got the decorative icon. It's got a few styles, including the fill color. This is a component, but it knows to interpret icon glyphs that are effectively components with vectors in them and derive their color and call it fill color. And then you also see something like title. And oh my gosh, what the heck is this conditional statement? This is as complicated as it gets, and it happened after a bunch of architectural decision record discussions. But it's by far the most complicated thing you would see. And to read this, a designer might be scratching their head, what the heck does this mean? But it really is an example of how we make choices in our Figma components that Figma actually doesn't really work like code, and you need to have a translation. So if you have, let's get this out of the way, you have this component here. It's very common to have a pair of things like show icon and icon, and then show title and title, and that's what I'll focus on here, where if you have a title, you bind it in Figma to two different things. A visibility prop, which is called a Boolean prop in Figma, to show and hide it, and then a text prop to actually carry through the string to that variable. And so from that perspective, that is something where we can interpret that data and actually have the script itself consolidate that into one prop. Because here, show title is the visibility prop, but in code the way it works is you just put in a title, and the presence of a string means include the title, and the absence of a string, or when it's null, means don't include it. And you can map those things then to the title itself, and that's what that conditional statement is. And so the fact that Figma doesn't work like code, and we have other things in here where you can infer number props if the default is a number, we're really trying to derive the intent and characterize it in a way that is very clear and deterministic. A second component that we have is the button component. Here, I love PropStar, by the way. If you haven't used PropStar, that's what produces these grids of the component itself. But let's run the button component, generating that. And the fact is, the button has some things going on, but the spec really isn't that long. There's a way to suppress all of these, what I'll call empty variants, because they're really not telling you anything more. One of the advantages of how Figma works is it has this big variant grid, so you can see all the different combinations of things. One of the disadvantages is it's all repetitive junk when it comes to actually your design intent. And so you have, in effect, 9 different variants corresponding to a disabled button. Here, for example, the small rest state of the button here is one of the 9 disabled ones. But that results in 10 layers. Each layer has 30 properties. Each one of them across 9 variants. So 10 times 30 is 300 times 9 is like 270 property value pairs. And really, there is a way, and it's scriptable. It's not that complicated. It's probably somewhere closer to the top, actually, to have the one rule that is the design intent, and that's all of those variants are represented just by that little piece of data. And so how can the loquacious, verbose kind of Figma model be distilled down into, that's my design intent. When it's disabled, make its opacity 0.36, or, ooh, goodness, maybe I should be using my disabled token for that instead of a raw value. Let me fix that as a result. And so that kind of loquaciousness, really, I would like a future where I'm just declaring what those values are. The third thing I'll show in the demo is slots are great. And so when you have all of these different pieces, for example, an action list that includes groups of actions, each of which include items of actions, and you can have group headers, and the overall action list header itself, you make sure it's selected. But if you want to match subcomponents via naming conventions that typically most design system teams that I work with will employ, when you generate this particular structure, and actually maybe one of the settings was not set correctly, because you can see it's a little bit longer. But effectively create not just the actionless spec itself, you can see things like the anatomy and the props and the default, but also the subcomponents, and start to group the relationships of components only intended to be used in a context of a particular parent. The other thing is that we have started to use what are called code-only props, where if you notice, well, where did this come from? The children of the action list overall could be anything of an item, a group, or a header, and the minimum number of items is 1. And those are a practice that a few of my clients have started to employ, where they have what we're calling code-only props. Those props are added as props here, but they're actually housed in, if I go one level deeper, in a 0x0 clipped frame that has essentially hidden text layers that are bound to those code props. And so even though the designer isn't necessarily trying to expose anything to the designers using those assets, they are trying to expose, here's a certain rule that we have a structure for that should flow through into developing the system component code itself. And accessibility labels on text areas where you have the minimum and maximum number of characters or rows as it grows. Those are all kinds of choices that the designer can start to convey structurally with their intent into that component. Going back to the actual command line interface tool, it looks like, oh my gosh, it didn't do any of it. It stopped. That's great. That's really helpful. Let me pause here. It says to manually update settings. Oh my gosh, just go. OMG, just go. Come on. So what I'm going to do is just show you, it'll come back and you can watch it produce the stuff. But effectively, it can produce everything from the command line via what amounts to 5 different commands. The first command is going to be you initialize an environment. That effectively, or I npm installed on stage. Somebody said yesterday not to do that. But effectively, you initialize the environment and you set all those same kind of settings I was just walking through to configure it how you want your specs to appear. You do that step once. You fetch the data. You just say specs fetch, and you have a personal access token in your environment, and it will fetch all your Figma files that you want to fetch. You then do a step to scan the library. And what that does is that creates a manifest of the different, let's see, I wonder if it's here, all the different components. And that's actually what it's doing now. So I told it to select 3 of them. So we actually might see all these things get deselected. But effectively, it detects or scans for all the components. It just deselected all of them because it knows how to follow the rules. But this becomes, as you continually generate components, as the Figma file changes, once an hour, once a day. I don't care how often you do it. My clients just set up a GitHub action to fetch it and refresh the data. And effectively, you can see it's doing the action list and the alert and the button, the 3 components that we just did. And then the last thing is that you just say, then generate the components. And so it went through and did it under a number of different situations. Here, but the command looks something as simple as just generate, use this manifest, and put the specs in this particular place. And so that's what it went through. Since it's still doing these kind of actions for you, what I would want you to take away from this is it's just a black box. It's a script, but it's producing all of the design intent that is relevant, the designers have put into their file, in a much more concise way that can be leveraged. And so one of the things I asked it to do, trust me, I wasn't cheating and writing this myself, is, well, compare, for example, the button file. So as it compared the button file, what did we learn? And if you're working with the raw JSON and you're thinking about tokens or you're just thinking about specificity, you're going to get 42,065 lines. But if you just worked with the process YAML that what I was showing is just 442 lines. It's more than 99% smaller than what you saw before. It effectively processes into a much simpler node and element structure. The number of properties it has is a lot fewer. It has a range of key differences. But ultimately, if you scroll down to this, it says, yeah, I like this data better. And so it's changed to human-readable names. It's using token references, and there's a way to actually add custom token names so that if you have a token service, you can just flow through how your client wants to see their tokens reflected in the spec rather than how Figma requires tokens to be specified as variables, and all of that stuff happens. And so going back to the slides then, actually, I just have some other reflections on how things worked. Keeping my focus on the intent of the tool has been hard. It's just component specs. People are like, can you add design tokens to your service? No, that's not my problem to solve. We've already got solutions for that. But I could imagine in the future working on compositions, page templates, patterns, as all these different, more expressive things we have an opportunity to explore, adding those things to tools like this. There's a whole lot of challenges that I still have in front of me. This thing is not perfect. If you have non-unique layer names, that's a problem I need to solve. I don't support people that use Token Studio, and they were great in supporting the initial specs plugin and so on. There's lots of things about slots and compositions and patterns that, frankly, my client work is going to start when I get back from this conference and start working on that stuff. And so as we translate from Figma to code, the kinds of things that I'm thinking about is I realized what I value out of the process. And I favor the design intent over a lot of inference that could go wrong. AI can interpret lots of stuff and get 80, 90, 95, 97% correct. But when I'm making a system that other people are going to use, they have to trust it's going to be better than what they would have done themselves. And so 99.9% is kind of essentially the bar I like to hold myself to. I also appreciate things being empirical or over being intuition. When you do that fetch and then that generate call, it takes 4 seconds to download the file. It takes 1 second per component. Or actually, if you do 50 components, it takes 6 seconds. And so you can sit and wait for MCP to do all of its poking and prodding and hunting and treasure hunting. Or you can just download the whole thing, create a spec, and then you have a data structure that you can completely analyze yourself in about 5 seconds. And so to me, I'm into that. But I'm more into, and then the next time you do it, you can compare it to see how it's different. You can see how it's changing. You can see what you added, what you took away, and what actually, as values, were different from what it was before. I also favor things that are complete. I'm exhaustive in the way it looks at every single style and binding across every single layer, across every single variant, and it finds the differences and just tells you what the differences are, because that's really what you're looking for out of that. I also favor things that are compact over a bunch of cruft. If I want to say something's disabled true, can I just give you a rule? Tell you that make all the disabled things at the root level 0.36 opacity, and that's that, as opposed to creating hundreds of layers that have thousands of properties on them. I also favor precision, like I talked about before, where you have custom particular names that teams are going to want their tokens to be reflected in. And so how can you flow those into the data really well? Well, that's a solved problem. But Figma isn't as good as code. We know that. And it makes me really concerned, like this example here with this swipey, scrolly thing. This is the current, last week, my client, we were talking about this. We don't know what to name this component. Do we include the word scroll? Do we call it a carousel? The point is that you might have a mobile interface where you're swiping pills back and forth, and when you start to swipe, those buttons appear. So we had conversations. Well, okay, should the slot be absolutely positioned and then use auto layout to have the paging buttons on top? Or should the paging buttons be absolutely positioned and pinned to the sides? And then we have to translate that because they don't use right and left. They use pinning and a different way to model it. And then the actual children are laid out in auto layout. And then the Kevin Powell, who I think we'll hear talk later today, the Kevin Powell of that project I work with, he goes, I would totally do this a third way, and Figma doesn't support it. And he goes, you know that thing we did in React before where it's 0 height? And that doesn't work because it starts to obscure the behaviors. And we started to realize also, okay, not only is the layout not available, but I'm like, gosh, we have so much motion to think about. How do we snap the alignment? Is there elasticity to when you swipe it and it hits the edge? Are you going to scale the alpha when it comes in? Are you going to ease it out? Is there a delay? Is there a velocity to different types of ways that it scales out? All these things, Figma has motion in it, kind of. Nobody uses that feature. And so how are we going to convey those kinds of specs into that? And so as I think about stuff in Figma that's very complete and well modeled, and start to transition into this place where Figma has partial modeling of stuff, and my current client work marked in orange, it's making the job harder. And I know that we're going to reach a point where Figma, or at least the way people use Figma, doesn't offer it at all. And how are we going to merge those kinds of specs into the process? Because when you have handoff, it's not just a bunch of generated data from Figma. There's a lot of other knowledge that needs to be handed off too. And so that thing at the bottom of the screen here, less structured specs, you see layout, behavior, accessibility, is motion going to fit into there? It's not unstructured. It's not, let's throw it in a markdown file and hope for the best. That's where we'll start. But then we'll start to derive the structure, and we already have, to organize our things by general rules versus platform-specific rules that we have. And so we have marked things by iOS, web, or React, or Android. And how do we start to feed that service so that as we make components over and over again, because that coding box is going to take like no time, and it's going to start happening constantly, repetitively, such that it has everything that it's going to need. But also, I'm going to start asking, who gates what steps? When are they going to be gated? How do developers participate in the early AI stuff that we're doing? How do designers get called back in to participate later? And what triggers us to go backwards? And what shouldn't trigger you to go backwards? And how far back do you need to go based on each of those triggers? Do we just need to regenerate specs, or do we need to go all the way back to the plan stage? People got so hung up on this, like, we have generated specs, it's now done. The developers just started building coding stuff, and I saw it happen over the last year. They all stopped talking to each other completely. And it was like 2 different teams, and I was like, oh my gosh, we have to come back together. And so now we're starting to weave back as the agentic stuff is starting to take shape in all the different steps to get us connected and gated and conversing more. Figma also isn't the same with itself. It's very frustrating when you run into the fact that, well, in runtime in the Figma plugin environment, you can go and grab whatever styles and notes and layers that you need. But in Figma REST, you actually have to map the styles and variables into it, but that's the opportunity to then flow in the other stuff that you want to have as being custom. But that's sort of how those two things work. It's a little bit harder when you start seeing the shape of the data. So as the Figma plugin represents typography different from the Figma REST API, you start to realize actually letter spacing is different. You need to write transformers and adapters for those things. When you start to realize the REST API only gives you stuff when you ask for it called geometry, such that when you don't get the geometry, you have to rely and transform things like absolute bounding box, which works every single time except when you rotate the layer. And so almost nobody ever rotates any layers. And so can we live without the geometry? Yeah, now you can download your files a lot faster. Gradients require math. The plugin has one type of model. The Figma REST API has another type of model. They can be transformed together, but if you have a math degree like I do, okay, that's not difficult to make sure you're doing the right thing. The last thing I'll close on is ADRs. Like, I got really lit up because for years we've been making decisions along the way as we talk about not just our components, but how we make our components. But where do we write these down? Like, how do we actually decide these things? And it turns out this architectural decision records, or ADRs, have been around for a long time. It's a document that captures specific design choices with context alternatives, rationale, and implementation direction. And so when we faced particular things, do we want to actually just use Figma's props and call our props padding left, right, top, and bottom? Or do we want to have a different way to refer to it, and what terms do we use? Well, we modeled it deliberately differently, and you see things like start and end. And that took the form of how we understood it, created the context. This took about 10 seconds for AI to help us scaffold it up, and then talk through the different things we value. Is left and right good? Actually, we prefer leading and trailing maybe, but ultimately we landed on start and end to make a decision. And so this is all a kind of conversation that we have as we continue to model this schema that these specs are based on, that we start to record in these ADRs that we just have agents for now. I just say, create create this ADR and help us deal with the padding, as it were. And then once we make the decision, implement it throughout the schema, and then implement it in TypeScript types, and now implement it into the other tools that we have, and accept it. And so one of the things that we also have started to use as a skill is naming. Actually, I should say skill, but as you think about the name of things like padding or aspect ratio or whatever kind of property that, as we're in layout, it's a lot more complicated. Compare the platforms, and when two of them match, use that term. Or when two of the models match, use that model. Or if one code platform matches Figma and is different from the other two, favor that one. And if one or more code platforms don't match with each other and don't match with Figma, consider Figma, but then prove that it can still be transformed between them. And so those kinds of conversations are us with AI trying to figure out how to have a source of truth of our decisions, but still have a place to refer to it. I'll leave you with good design systems ship, and that is what everybody is using AI to do now. Produce, produce, produce. But better design systems are going to be able to change, and change predictably, and the best design systems are going to be equipped to flow change through an ecosystem that's predictable, performant, and error-free. And so that's why I believe I want to have a place in the future where I can see the decisions and see the change in those decisions as we evolve together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nathan. Do you want to come and take a seat? Should we?
Sure.
Should we do this? I'm just gonna.
I don't know. What are we going to do?
What are we going to do? What should we talk about? Lots of questions. So there's so much information there. There's a lot to go at, and I think you've sparked a lot of imaginations. And I know I'm full of questions as well. Let's get into it. Let's get into a few of these. And I think a couple of them, a couple of the questions that came in were really thinking about, how much to use Figma and how to use Figma and how comprehensive it can be. And one of the questions I'll read out here from Juliana, she was mentioning that both you and Christine yesterday mentioned that, you may have addressed this a tiny bit at the end there, both mentioned that Figma cannot properly reflect all of the complex design kind of interactions, and it can't all be expressed in code. So then why use Figma as the source of truth? I think you were kind of alluding to that a little bit at the end there, right?
I see Figma as an origin of truth. I don't see Figma ultimately as where I want to keep the truth.
Yeah.
But it's also because I see Figma's limitations. Its motion model is weaker, or at least weak enough that people don't use it. Its layout model, like, I'm not a big pie chart person, but if it's certainly not nearing a full pie of all the layout things that you can do in Figma. And case in point, you can't have an inline floating icon inside a piece of text that wraps. I mean, that's just so basic. And so if Figma is unable to keep pace and explode, we're going to be living in parts of the past that might be decades old in terms of how we want to have certain things behave. And people talk about Figma being a canvas. It's still a very important canvas. It's a great collaborative tool. It helps you explore and monitor and get feedback on all sorts of different expressions of your design. Yeah. But I can't see it necessarily changing at the rate it needs to, because the VPs at our companies are like, we want everything to be motion. We want everything to have our compositions and layout patterns. They're talking about stuff that Figma is not tooled to do yet.
Right, well. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And Patrick also kind of was asking in the questions, another practical thing about using Figma and how it can be difficult to kind of keep the structure and the conventions for naming things and just keeping things organized in there. He's really asking about how do you keep adding metadata into Figma to kind of keep things organized and kind of enforce naming conventions? Are there any ways to do that, or any tips for keeping things organized in Figma and adding all that extra metadata in?
Well, two or three things. The first is that literal additional structure, like you saw with the code-only properties that I demoed. That's expensive, but it's definitely intentional and has helped us convey ideas. Yeah. The second thing is that we did have a rules file that, if you're using tools like TJ demoed, and you have rules around naming things, that AI can do really well to help you scan for those things. But the third thing that we're doing now that we've got this is effectively a command line tool that we can generate the specs for the entire library in one file in like less than a minute. Just analyze it. Like, just ask AI, how are our prop names consistent or not?
Right.
How is our, the terms we're using? And that has proven incredibly effective.
Yeah.
One of the things last week we did was, as we put a generated set of Figma assets ready for the devs to use, is it sort of barfed on some variables, and we were like, what is going on? It was just ghost variables that had been deleted from the variable collection, and it couldn't resolve what they were anymore.
Right.
And it's because they still had the same names as the new variables, and so that was just stuff that we figured out and took like 10 minutes, and then we just changed the variables and moved on.
It does feel like some of the more mundane, if you like, administrivia around keeping organized is a really good application of these kind of tools, these AI tools. By the way, I absolutely loved seeing, prompt engineering is a thing, context engineering is a thing. I loved seeing how you get the best from an AI through the prompt, where you say, "Come on, just do it," like to speak to it like an impatient teenager. That's it was effective.
Well, but that's the thing. Patience is one of the things I think about. Because I'm impatient using MCP tools because I just have to sit there and wait for it to do its thing.
Yeah.
When I know, I can just run a script and get all the answers I want.
Right.
So it's not just about the spec thing, but a lot of other things. I feel like I'm trying to build agents that are supported by scripts that make the agents work a lot faster. It's not just about just natural language commands and leaving it at that.
Yeah. There was another part to Patrick's question as well, which tallies with something that's been in my mind. Yesterday, talking with Christine, we're just kind of reflecting on the fact that the tools have changed so much. We're not slicing up Photoshop files anymore. That's not what we're doing. Do you think that? So Patrick's question is, do designers like this? And I'm kind of also thinking that the tools have such an impact, and the medium has such an impact on how designers design. Of course, that's going to change and evolve, and this feels like a real step change for how design might manifest and what the process of designing might be. So, yeah, I guess Patrick put it much more succinctly. Do designers like this?
I think I can't speak for designers.
Of course,
I can only speak for me.
Yeah,
and I like it because I've had a career where I've bounced between being a designer and a developer, and I do product managing of design systems but really, I feel like I'm going back to my information architecture roots with the work that I'm doing. So do I like it? Do I like having the capability to do a lot more that I couldn't do before? Yes, and I feel like some of the easy things, to me, I don't want to talk about tokens anymore, because tokens are easy. Tokens are solved. But I'll tell you what's not solved. I'm excited about now we can actually do some pattern work. Now I can actually dive into motion more, because the tools help me shape things a lot faster and in a way that I feel smarter.
Sure.
So yeah, I like that feeling.
Yeah, I feel like the impact is so profound, and it is so empowering for people designing in a medium where you need systems, right? You absolutely need systems. So I'm excited by that. I'm always kind of reflecting on some designers that I've worked with in the past who were incredibly talented, visually very, very talented, but slightly slower to move across to these new ways of working. But I agree with you. I think it's so empowering for that, and so essential for the way that we have to be designing for these tools. I had a slightly more practical question as well from Tayman in the document, who was just wondering about comparing this approach for when you've got a greenfield project where you're starting from scratch versus if you're inheriting a project that maybe already has a component library or some sort of design system. It's not a greenfield. Can these tools be applied there as well? And is it more challenging to get this in place for something that is partially organized ahead of time?
So I had the pleasure of talking with TJ about this exact problem at the speakers dinner, and I think I like the way he framed it, and I might try to frame it as well as I can. I think tools like this give the systems the ability to talk to each other faster and in a more well-modeled, deliberate way. And so if designers have a new future they want to see in Figma, they can have that be very succinctly described and still compared with code and understand the differences in code. I also have a lot of, maybe faith is the wrong word, but ambition that changing the code to reflect the design intent when there is a gap between the two is going to be a lot easier. And the bigger problem is also easier in getting that change piece of code deployed into the implemented place where you need to migrate all that other stuff. One of the other things we talked about was there's this guy named Ed from Twitter before it became X when they did a redesign in like 2022. And I just remember the quickest path to getting the entire new visual language done was one massive PR that Ed made that everybody else had to review and do stuff. And you know what? It worked. And he wasn't even using AI. And so like today, I'd like to think that there's more ambition that we can take to propagate and trigger change, or trigger and propagate change across a broader surface area that designers never could do before.
So much food for thought, so many questions that we haven't managed to get to, but luckily, after the break, you and TJ are having an unplugged session, right? Which I think that's here on this stage, and and I know that during the break, you'll have a chance, everyone, to add your questions about design systems and some of the topics that Nathan has covered to the board out there, and then hopefully we'll be able to get a chance to talk about that a little bit more. But for now, thank you so much for a great talk. Your appreciation, please, for Nathan Curtis.